social life of a technology, which we may understand as technology's activation or vivification, is stressed over and over in this section, kind of theorization. I want to point to the familiar work of Albera and Tortellana and their provocation that the dispositive does not exist, this idea that the dispositive does not exist. And they ask, what is to be done with this issue of power? And so moving in the direction of an answer, they identify two meanings of dispositive in Foucault's work. And of course here I'm gesturing to the side to Thomas Hirschhorn's collage, cardboard, paper, plastic, foil, tape, prints, marker, which is showing some of the distributed networks of power and knowledge as a kind of a totem or touch point for my talk. So two meanings of dispositive in Foucault's work. The first being the apparatus in itself, for example, the panopticon is a technical design. And here I'm illustrating it with the entity of the Presidio Modello, which is a 5 panopticon prison structure, which still stands as a remains, a remnant in Isla de Juventud in Cuba. It was built between 1926 and 28. And so the apparatus as technical design and entity. And here I chose a photograph of the panopticons. There are 5 of them, and the one in the middle is still under construction, just to kind of emblematize the processual nature of the apparatus as entity, as technology. And then, of course, the second account of dispositive as a set of practices that produce a context-specific relationship of power. This is a photograph taken inside one of the Presidio Modello panopticons during the time that the structure was in use. It was taken in 1926, so we see the men in the panopticon. And I'm using this to gesture toward the idea that panopticism is an episteme enacted. The Bentham design was intended to be open and humane in its uses, to treat patients, but also to instruct school children, to house the insane. So panopticism, as we understand it as a relationship through which repressive power is enacted within the structure of the panopticon, is only one expression of activity within that structure. These men in different generations would riot and strike. 50 years ago, the Presidio Modello was brought down and closed on the basis of the action of the men in their structure. So their actions articulate the apparatus in a particular reformation of power dynamics, demonstrating that the dispositive is always a relational and historically situated field. And finally, a photograph of the interior of the now abandoned Presidio Modello, reproduced on Atlas Obscura. So it's a structure, the dispositive is a structure that is durational, that is contingent on practice, which may include the life of the remains. So when Foucault describes a dispositive to reconstruct a formation of power, he teases out the epistemological project enacted in a given relational and performative practice in which an instrument, the apparatus in the narrow sense, is caught up. And the episteme is not knowledge per se, but a knowledge system subjected to contestations of practice. And so finally we see performance within the schema of the dispositive. In this case, it's remains. And here the embodied activity of tourism and local leisure as the Presidio Modello becomes a site of kind of social leisure engagement in Cuba today, and a site of tourism, where the mobile gaze, facilitated by the apparatus of the bicycle, becomes part of a relational field of historical memory. And so instruments is a term that I'll be using throughout this paper to designate the dispositive or the apparatus in the narrow sense of technology or tools. And like the signifier, the instrument is open and shifting in its meanings and uses. And I choose the word instrument specifically for its relationship to sound and music, which I'll be demonstrating soon. So I'm looking toward a speculative theory, a speculative approach to media history. I teach in a new speculative design program in the visual arts department at the University of California, and I'm interested in speculative histories. To propose a theory of the dispositive is always speculatively transitive, transhistorical, and transmediating. This direction of doing media archaeology from the standpoint of embodied experience with instruments is of course not new, and it's best demonstrated in the line of work pioneered by Vivian Sobchak, whose training with Don Eide, a philosopher of phenomenology and technology, grounds her early concern in the address of the eye with not one subject position in the spectator, but two spectators. The spectator of the film and the spectator in the film proposed to be an active agent. So this idea that the film image constitutes a point of agency is shared in science and technology studies with the work of Bruno Latour and later on actor network theory. And for me, within feminist STS, feminist science and technology studies, this is an important point of interface between film and media studies on the one hand and science and technology studies on the other. You may recognize this painting as the work that was used to illustrate the cover of Vivian Sobchak's Address of the Eye. And I want to say a little something about this as an emblem of Vivian Sobchak's theory of phenomenology, of experience, and its overlaps with media archaeology. It's an oil portrait of the poet Edward James, a favorite line by, of course, Rene Magritte. And a favorite line of Edward James of mine is, "Medicate me with a pile of letters." So Edward James begins his work as a poet with the idea that poetry is something that can medicate, that can help with a malaise. He famously used his family fortune. He was the son of William James, who had inherited a vast family fortune. He used this money to amass a lot of surrealist paintings, and he also supported the publication of Minotaur, the surrealist publication. And he was plagued throughout his life by rumors that, in fact, William James was not his father. So he was plagued with this idea of reproductive uncertainty. And so this painting, we see Vivian Sobchak's thesis on the cover of her book of two agents of spectatorship performed. And Edward James here gazes into a mirror that offers ontological certainty. The body is present to him, present to himself, but there is epistemic uncertainty. The features of his face, a central source of identity, and the idea of descent is hidden. The mirror invested with agency fails to make the subject present to himself in his historicity. But for Edward James, painting did not offer an infrastructure that supported his vision. It did not medicate him. After World War II, he sold off his vast collection of paintings to build Las Posas, the wells, the park-like grounds of a coffee estate he owned in Xilicla, Mexico, a rainforest where he invested more than $5 million in US dollars to build a surrealist landscape. The site was among other things, a kind of an amusement park of sculpture. He ultimately decided that he wanted an immersive space for embodied and sensory experience to situate himself in relationship to the world, because paintings and poetry did not kind of do it for him. So his body and its instrumentation in this surrealist context required a new medium. And here we see the transformed natural space of the rainforest, and an environment for James's body's immersion and mobilization amidst sculptures that are framing, sculptures that are gigantic, not just iconic, like the hands, but designed to perform the envelopment of the body, the instrumentalization of the body's immersion and mobilization through space, light, and form, through water, earth, and foliage. And here we see the sculpture as an experiential frame. And I couldn't help but include Tilda Swinton on a recent shoot at La Posas, climbing the park's stairs to nowhere, the famous stairs to nowhere. So the park is designed to underscore the surrealist insight that the instrumentation of space orients the body in an epistemic configuration that may be extensive, but which is always rife with speculative logics and inconsistencies. Dead ends provide a view, and the potential for both risk and circumvention are present in the physical operative maneuvering through the space. So here I'm going to make a shift to my own work and away from this tangent off of Vivian Zubek's book cover to begin in earnest with a different kind of image that's more familiar to some of the things that I've done in film and media studies. And this is a photograph of a technician who handles an imaging device, what looks like a camera. It's a photograph documenting the technique for using a moving transducer carriage in an early compound ultrasound scanner produced in 1964 in the United States. And this photograph was published in Time magazine. So what looks like a photography setup is, of course, sound technology. In this frame, we see a technician, a female technician, pulling down a camera-like device that's on a spring to bring it in contact with the abdomen of a man who lies still on a bed, a hospital gurney. The technician is a worker in an experiment intended to model diagnostic process. She holds the camera-like transducer out at arm's length and moves its lens-like sensors over the belly of the reclining man, over the abdomen, physically stroking, making contact with the lens-like transducer on the abdomen of the man's body. She's tracing the organs in a gesture that might be likened to panning and scanning, but also to stroking with a brush. The transmitter, which stands in the place of the camera lens, converts electrical signals into sound waves that, upon their reflection off of internal organs toward which they are pointed, will be converted back into electrical signals by a receiver. So in the place of the lens, we have two instruments. We have a receiver and we have a transmitter. So the lens has become double. The position and density of an object is determined by variations in time between sending and receiving of the signal. But there's another instrument that's not as obvious in this photograph, and that is the tiny monitor, the video monitor, a playback projector of sorts, which is visible in the left-hand side of the frame. And it's quite tiny here. Here are some of the quantitative variable units of measurement that are optically rendered in grayscale from this exact unit and displayed on the video monitor in scales of lights and darks. So these are essentially video frame grabs from the scanning from that apparatus we just saw. And of course, this early period of ultrasound, the optical translation of the quantitative sound measurement data is rendered in a photographic-like form. But there's more to the instrumentation of this practice. The transducer is held in place not only by the hands of the female technician, but also by a mechanical arm that is mounted to the moving carriage positioned above the reclining body. This is one of the designs for an articulating arm scanning apparatus from the period. My emphasis is not on the media text produced then, nor on spectatorship or looking practices per se, but the hands of the camera-like instrument's operator. And the hands at work here are, of course, multiple. Those of the articulating scanner, those of the female technician, but also the hands of the patient, which here hold the cord that connects the camera to the video monitor. And he's holding the cord, of course, to move it out of the way of the transducer, but we might also suggest that he's lending a hand to the radiological technician, helping a bit in the production of his medical images, but perhaps more importantly, he finds in the instrument a lifeline, a place to hold on and connect himself physically into the circuit of practice that will provide him with a diagnosis. The monitor offers perhaps something like the self-image, the playback that Sobchak asks us to consider in understanding the agency of the screen image. But its contribution is not just self-mirroring or instant playback, the experience of real time, in the senses introduced by Nick Coldry around liveness and TV news, for example, or in Rosalind Krause's interpretation of Joan Jonas's early video practice, or Akanchi's. Rather, the video monitor offers something more important to the life of the subject that can be experienced only later. And so we see this image and we think of it as the scene of the dispositive, the pertinent activity. But in fact, there is another private scene that is off screen here. And that is the private interpretive screening of the images produced here by the radiological physician, who will take the footage provided on the video monitor and analyze it not only in real time, but more significantly in static frame grabs. So the dispositive is disintegrative and also chimeric. Its forms of instrumentation shifting and transforming in performative and durational negotiations of power over time. And the technician out of frame, the radiographic physician technician, works in collaborative and performative practice with the agents that I've identified here. But he is necessarily and importantly operating in a different time frame, in a different room. And like the animator, he works in a dark room. He works alone and he works with his hands on the image. So here it becomes necessary, as I'm beginning to negotiate the relationship among agents in the scene of the dispositive, to talk about the biopolitical dimensions of a clinical camera body. Whose body is the clinical camera body? I've identified at least 4. And so the clinic is, of course, a scene of labor and distributed practice. There's not so much cooperation among subjects in the scene of the dispositive as negotiation of professional roles and identities in the performance of work. It's the case that the woman technician is a medical assistant, the out-of-frame radiologist physician for whom the images are being produced is of a higher order of profession, and the patient is a subject who presumably labors under the pressure of illness, symptoms, and perhaps pain. To describe their relationship as collaborative would be to mistake the dynamics of power that structure a field rife with dependency, authority, and economy. So we may add to this the camera body as instrument in its biopolitical involutions that perform some of these negotiations. So I'm shifting the focus, in a word, from the screen to the camera as a pivot point of negotiation and another kind of location of agency. And here I'm going to provide some kind of slides offering a bit of theoretical framework. So from the previous diagram in which I've identified Lazarotto's work on biopower, I zero in on his essay, Tailoring Biopolitics, published in 2006. He reminds us that bodies are not always trapped in dispositives of power. Rather, we need analyses that come from below, that give us an idea of the constitution of dispositives as active fields, beginning with the analysis of micromechanisms that are invested, involuted, transformed. And so one of my main concerns here is to connect this idea of interpreting micromechanisms with the micro-analyses of situated practice analysis in ethnographic science and technology studies. I'll get to that in a moment. So to perform this analysis from below, we would need to understand who and what are below in any given dispositive's infrastructural schema. And here I'm introducing the idea of an infrastructure as a means, a concept from science and technology studies through which to theorize the dispositive. We might see the patient as quite literally below, under the camera. Or we might regard the female technician who operates the lens-like stylus of the transponder, the sonographic transponder, as the subordinate subject, the skilled service worker. the behind-the-scenes immaterial laborer who produces the electronic materials that will be read later by the more highly ranked and paid expert physician radiologist. So what I'm trying to do here is introduce this idea of immaterial labor as something that predates the digital and that exists in the ultrasound clinic of the late 1950s, early 1960s, when this technology is first introduced. And I understand that that's a stretch to talk about immaterial labor, and I'm trying to suggest that the work done in the clinic of the ultrasound facility in fact prefigures the work that's done later in the laboratory when the images are analyzed. And so the female technician's labor, largely often female technician's labor, is immaterial in that it informs the real work of interpretation that's done later. And that this is a transmedia field where sound becomes image and diagnosis is ultimately remote, conducted in the absence of both the camera body and the pathological body. The diagnosis is done in a private, quiet room by the doctor alone and will be given to the patient later. So I add to Lazzarotto's biopolitics his notion of immaterial labor as objects of study together for the media archaeologist. So the questions for me become how to identify, show, and interpret power dynamics as they unfold in human-machine dispositives in which infrastructural and intersubjective relationships are both complementary but also incompatible. How to observe and study antagonisms between hierarchy and cooperation as they unfold in mediated interaction in the dispositives infrastructures, and how to perform strategic interaction within what Lazzarotto describes as infinitesimal mechanisms that are invested, involuted, and agential. And I won't talk at length about this particular slide, but here I just gestured toward a number of different sources that allow us to bring together the interface of science and technology studies and film and media studies. And I want to highlight the work of Lucy Suchman, human-computer interaction, sociologist Lucy Suchman, its plans and situated action. So there's a Freudian slip toward the filmic and pans and situated actions on my slide, and her work on human-computer interaction, along with Edwin Hutchins's Cognition in the Wild, about the use of computers by military sailors on a boat, navigating the movement of the boat through the use of the screen. I want to tie this together with both the film and media phenomenology of Sobchak, the old and new apparatus theory, the new media archaeology, and importantly, sensory ethnography. But moving backward to some of my previous work to illustrate this further and to demonstrate that this, the importance of moving between periods to try and understand that some of these paradigms, how to interpret situated practice with archival materials becomes a crucial question. And this account will always be speculative, of course. In an earlier essay published in Science and Context, the journal Science and Context, I interpret the exterior of a box. It's a box in the collection of Erkki Huhtamo. And it's a box used by a traveling lantern slide projectionist to show slides, but also he used it to store his worldly belongings, his clothing, his food, inside the projection box while he traveled from site to site. So this box is outfitted with straps, and it's much like the box worn by this organ grinder in this mid-18th century Enlightenment era print of an illustration by Edmé Bouchardon. And interestingly, the etching was done by Anne Takalis. So Edmé Bouchardon, however, is the well-known sculptor who produced this red chalk drawing. Here's another version in which the organ grinder is tending to her magic lantern box. So the back plane of the box in Huhtamo's collection that I analyzed had a slight concave worn section to it. And this was an indent worn into the wood of the box by the body of the projectionist, who carried it strapped to his back. And it was an indentation from his spine into the box. And so I proposed in that essay that instead of engaging in the practices of, on the one hand, opening up some bodies for interpretation and opening up the black box to understand the infinitesimal relationships of technology inside the box, that we actually looked at the box as an interface and looked at the surface of the box in its interaction with the body, where it joins with the laboring human subject. So, of course, this body that we're looking at here, the Bouchardon organ grinder body, carries a musical instrument in front. Her hands are freed from the projector, not to do work of image production, but to do work of sound production. She grinds the organ that's in front of her body. The hands crank this other instrument, and this, by the way, is one of 60 illustrations that make up the volume called Cries of Paris by Bouchardon, red chalk sketches that are reproduced in these etchings, 12 to a set. There were 60 of them, food vendors, music vendors. And I underscore here that what was being hawked or sold by this woman was not goods or food, but a service. She's a service worker who's using the sound of the organ grinder to lure in patrons for her images on her back. So she would attract attention and then put down the box, set up the projector, and offer a show. The scholar Katie Scott, in her analysis of this series, describes the mechanical music in the cries as ululations made to pierce the shell of consumer indifference. And the scholar Brett Bream, discussing this image set, writes about the attention to the auditory appeals of Paris vendors from a range of figures, including Mallarmé, who wrote a poem after the organ grinder, and also Adorno, who compared the early cranked barrel organ to the phonograph. But I want to jump forward and make a connection from the street vendor to Valley Export, going back to the period of the female technician in the lab of 1964. Here is a piece from the same period, Valley Export, performing as an audiovisual machine of immaterial labor. So the concept of trying to put forward here is Valley Export as a vendor, and Valley Export as a kind of street vendor of embodying the problematic of immaterial labor. On one level, we may say that the dispositive, in the narrow sense, as a mechanical instrument, is produced by embodied subjectivity, but more accurately, the dispositive is produced as a concrete, plastic, and malleable social form through which power operates across fractured agential capacities. So the Vienna actionist and video performance artist Valley Export adopts the position of the mobile tripod, mounting film cameras to her body front and back to perform the labor of film production as embodied live performance. And on the right, you see individual frames of the film, and it's a split screen film. The screen is split into three. On the right, we see footage shot in 16 millimeter by another cinematographer of Valley Export's embodied performance. And then on the left, you see the footage from her two 8 millimeter cameras that were mounted to her body, top and bottom. So here I'm talking about just the right-hand portion of this frame. So her tripod body becomes an absence in the film that she herself has shot when it's projected later. With Peter Weibel, Valley Export came up with this concept of expanded cinema in 1967, predating Jean Youngblood's book of this title. And she also, during that period in 1968, performed this piece called Touch Cinema, in which she wore a box that was a kind of cinema projection booth into which she kind of vended contact with her breasts on the streets. And here Kurt Kren has filmed her performing this labor of a kind of a show that is in fact a touch a touch experience. And note that she's looking at a stopwatch to limit each customer to 30 seconds max viewing time. So I'm trying to draw connections to her performance here to the street vendor, the organ grinder, who uses sound to draw in the potential consumer of images. And here, Valley Export is using touch to problematize the notion of cinema as sensorial contact. And I gesture also toward Patrizia Maglia's analysis of the 1965 Brion Vega portable television in her essay of 2011, where Maglia suggests that the machines, this particular machine is designed in a way that performs a simple movement in our direction. So like Valley Export's offering up of the television-like box, the television itself offers itself up in an upward gesture toward the viewer, resonant with subject's analysis of the screen. But in understanding video, it is important to keep in mind that the Portapack has two bodies. The Portapack is a camera with an interface that is the box and the projector, like a camera, but also the box that holds the tape. And so it's a mobile and portable interface, but the camera has two bodies, just a kind of an aside. And I'm including Lazzarotto's 2014 theory of video, his ontology of video, with which I don't necessarily agree, so I'm not going to analyze this, but given that I'm following a pattern within his work, I thought it would be important to gesture to this essay about video as capturing movement itself, this kind of heightened realism of video. Rather, as a theory, I would look toward, again, Valley Export's second adjunct dislocations piece of the same year, 1973, which she performed until 1978, and then again, more recently, it's been kind of regenerated, in which, here in Bremen in 1978, we see her performing with a video camera on her back and on her front. And there is simulcast of what she's recording is being projected onto 4 video monitors, and there's an audience that you can see to the right of the frame here that watches the camera results of her performance on a screen in the real time of the gallery. So to understand the point I'm trying to make here, yes, she is laboring to produce an image, and she's using 2 cameras, one in front and one behind. She's a mobile tripod. The goal of the performance is to show the labor entailed in the recording of the videos on display. Her orientation directs the cameras toward paintings of lines. And in these sketches, we see the difference in the top frame. We see the 8mm setup. Her body is the tripod that becomes absent. But in the bottom setup, her body becomes very visible, making the technology of the tripod, the body as tripod, visible in the real time of watching the screen. And so I'd like to suggest that Valley Export's performances are clinical in the sense that they relate to the physical hands-on treatment of subjects rather than theoretical or laboratory studies. Her work is efficient, remote, and dispassionate on the matter of bodily contact, and she has an interesting bedside manner in the sense of maybe the bolster in the Italian sense of providing support in a tongue-in-cheek and ironic way. And that her work lends an interesting point of analysis for feminist situated action studies in which imaging is understood as a form of practice that we can attend to as performative practice. At this point, I'm going to skip over through some of the more theoretical framing for the project to show a couple of films. With an emphasis on a shift toward questions of documentary and David McDougall's notion that the film is responding, the viewer responds in responding to a film not only to content but to the postural schema of the film embodying the filmmaker. But I want to change this and say that what conveys from the standpoint is not only the postural schema of the filmmaker, but the camera body. And here we see Nicole Miller's exploratory transformation of the capabilities of the camera body in her work with documentary subjects. Nicole Miller is a Los Angeles-based contemporary installation artist who works with documentary video. These films are made only for museum installation, not for cinematic viewing. And she encounters subjects who she then addresses with the camera and then asks them to relate something about their personal experience. Oh no, I'm not going to be able to show this. It's on my desktop and it should be, oh I see, the link is to online. I'll show this one at the end because I mistakenly didn't embed it. But we see the footage of a man named David who was shot in a terrible convenience store robbery and lost his left arm in the process. And Nicole Miller interviews him as he works with his mirror through which he restores the appearance of his phantom limb. He has a phantom limb from the missing arm, and he works with a mirror in front of him, in which he sees his good arm, and it's projected onto the position of his missing arm. So his missing arm is here, the mirror is here, and he uses this arm to give himself a second arm and to restore his sense of wholeness as he explains the story of his traumatic experience to the cinematographer, Nicole Miller. And here I switch to the work of another contemporary video and performance artist who works in the gallery context, Christina Lammer, who's here with us in the conference, in the school this week. And here I'll be talking about an early work of hers. It's another example of documentary performing in the role, with the camera in the role as an interlocutor in the distributed, situated practice of a work that is restorative and involves intersubjectivity. This video is called Making Contact. It's a video project of 2006 centered in the interventional radiology suite of a hospital. And it was produced by sociologist and video and performance artist Christina Lammer. So in a series of projects begun in the late 1990s, Lammer, who is a PhD sociologist, was influenced by the actionist tradition. And she followed ethnographic sociological protocols to bring the camera into the surgical suite, into other hospital settings at the Medical University of Vienna, building rapport, not only with surgeons, but also with staff and with patients, to film interactional work, but to insert the camera as an operational tool within the setting, rather than making the camera invisible. She made the camera an interlocutor in the space of the procedure. And so here we see the surgeons and the medical staff suiting up, the process of using the hands on another's body to do the caretaking work of hygiene, of sepsis. Cameraless technique is being used in this process to diagnose the arteries of someone, but here the task of preparing involves a multiplicity of hands, and it's